Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 264 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Now, I've often been captured by a little line in the Gospels. The disciples ask a question that has been burning in their hearts and minds, and they ask Jesus, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" We see signs of competition among the disciples, each of them wanting to prove himself the most faithful or the most gifted. They want to know how they can best get to the top in the eyes of Jesus. I don't think they're expecting the answer Jesus gives. He says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Become like little children? What does that look like? How does that work? Why would little children be the greatest in the kingdom of God? Well, to help us with that question and others like it, my guest today is Lacy Finn Borgo, and we'll be talking about her latest book, Faith Like a Child, Embracing Our Lives as Children of God. I found our conversation very helpful personally, and I'm hopeful that you will too. Lacy Finn Borgo is the author of Spiritual Conversations with Children and the children's book, All Will Be Well. She teaches and provides spiritual direction for the Renovari Institute and the Companioning Center. She especially loves meeting with children at Haven House, a transitional facility for families without homes. Lacy holds a Doctor of Ministry in Leadership and Spiritual Formation and a certificate in Spiritual Direction from Portland Seminary. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad you found us. As always, I'd love if you'd share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. And now, let's dive into my conversation with Lacy Finn Borgo. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Lacy Finn Borgo, author of Faith Like a Child. Lacy, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation.
It's so good to be with you today.
Now, I've been looking forward to it, and I've enjoyed your book very much. I would love to start a conversation by asking if you'd just share a little of the story of how you came to write it.
Well, my first book, actually, Spiritual Conversations with Children, Listening to God Together, prompted this second book. So as I have been listening to children since I was a children, and as I've been training people to listen to children, and I noticed that sometimes what keeps us from being fully present to a child is our own distance from our childhood self. And so I started just sort of wondering, and I still don't have any answers to my wonderings, but I wondered, I wonder how our distance from our childhood self might be one of the reasons why we have less people volunteering for children's ministry. When we're with kids, we kind of get that, it rings our own childhood experience. Our knees get wobbly. And so I wrote that this was the prompt. I discovered so much more in the writing, but that was the prompt for this, my first exploration.
Well, that sounds really intriguing. So early on in the book, you say right up front that this book will explore what it looks like to remember or revisit or revive what has been part of us, our childhood selves, and to let the Spirit heal the childhood wounds that have calloused our hearts. In fact, two words I was sort of drawn to, the wounds of our childhood and the wonder of our childhood. I really like those two words. Can you say a little bit more about how those might be windows into our own recovering our childhood selves?
Yes. Well, I think those are the two areas that we wall off from us, both the wonder that we experienced and our woundedness. And we certainly wall off the woundedness, not really realizing that it also walls off the wonder and fresh, open, joyous experience of life that young children have. And I also have just a disordered attachment to all words that start with W. So I love with and wondrous. So I think those two, the words wounded and wonder, those are very closely connected with early childhood experience and what it looks like to welcome and get some healing for our childhood self.
Oh, that's so important. I know in my own journey that some of the therapeutic help I received was focused on some of those wounds that were a part of my own story, and that it wasn't until I started looking at those places and experiencing Jesus in the middle of places like that I found healing, but also a recovery of wonder and lightheartedness and maybe joy. Can you say a little more about what that journey to finding healing rather than hiding the wounds, letting ourselves see Jesus in the middle of those places?
Well, I think it's important both from I'm a parent of two adult children, and I think it's important for our parenting selves to say that everyone gets wounded. So we can, especially I think in our day and age, think, let me be hypervigilant so my child never experiences woundedness. So it does, if we're parents, also ring some of that, some of those connections. So that woundedness can be significant wounds that can use some therapeutic, tender attention, but it can also be some wounds that don't require. So we all have those kinds of wounds that happen in the world and to us throughout our lives. That's kind of part of the spiral of life. So I think that's important to notice, but also that when we take those wounds, whether they are wounds that need therapeutic attention, or the kind of wound that we just walk around a bit with a limp, to use the metaphor. When we take those wounds to Jesus, those wounds can be healed, and we can take them to Jesus in any number of ways. And they, some of those wounds can look like our picture of God, what we believed about God. They're very much connected to our picture of God is formed, not always, but primarily through the adults in our lives who had authority. And so it's a healthy and natural healing of that wound to get some separation from those adults and God. What is the picture of God? And as our friend, actually, Trevor Hudson likes to say that God looks like Jesus, that there is nothing in God that is not Christ-like. So we can bring our woundedness to Jesus and let him shape God's picture for us.
Yeah. Well, early in the book, in one of your chapters, it's titled Knowing God, Accepting Self. And you raise this sort of deceptively simple question, what's God like?
Yes.
I think a lot of us as adults assume, well, I already know the answer to that. Sunday school taught me it, or I've been a Christian long enough to know the answer to that one. But there are all, as you say, there's so many dynamics and persons in our lives that shape our vision of God in a way that doesn't look very much like Jesus. How might we enter into rediscovering what God is like?
Well, I think there's many, many wonderful ways. Can we just say that our God is generous and good and longs to be known? So there are many ways. One is through engaging with Jesus in the Gospels. That is one way. Another is to notice who in our life really loves us well, knowing that what is most loving in every creature to creature encounter. And when I say that, I mean, even like our pets and things. What I learned from children is how much our picture of God is shaped sometimes by our pets who love us well. Working with children at Haven House, which is a facility for folks without housing, the pets shape the child's picture of God very frequently. They are very near to them. At this facility, they're allowed to keep their pets when they come. This pet has probably kept them safe when they were living in their car. This pet keeps them warm on the Colorado nights. That is a lovely picture of God. God is allowing God's self to be revealed through this faithful pet. So it can be creatures. Nature often can tell us of God. Even, and this, I think this was the one that was most shocking and discovering to me, even what's good about myself is what God is like. So when I look at myself and I say, oh, I loved well there. That is what God is like. So reflecting on those places.
And that's so helpful. And what I love about the way you respond to that question is there are unexpected ways, like places we wouldn't expect to look to learn what God's like, that actually may be our best teachers.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I love about the parable of the sower that Jesus tells, and I grew up in West Texas, and we don't waste seed. And I mean, because there's not a lot of water and not a lot of great dirt. So, you place one seed, you're very, very careful with seed. I remember reading the parable of the sower as a child and thinking, that is just not a smart farmer. Just throwing that seed out everywhere. But that's what God is doing. God does throw out goodness and beauty and truth and wonder and awe. And reflecting on all of those are ways that God reveals God's self to us. Just generous.
Very generous. Yeah. Full of grace. So at one point, you talk about our experiences of fear, which is one of the ways we may experience, or the symptoms of our experience of childhood wounds. I know that's a part of my own experience. And you talk about our tendency to fight or to flee or to freeze, which maybe we're familiar with. But then you also talk about that we might tend and befriend our fear. Can you say a little more about what that might look like?
Well, sometimes we acquiesce and we become something that we're not in order to keep our fears at bay. So, I mean, just a general confession. I'm a people pleaser. I'm an Enneagram 3, and I people please when I am afraid. And that is tending and befriending. That's what that looks like. So I will sometimes, certainly more when I was younger, God's grace has been so good to me, and I am learning to do it less. But I can so easily can and cast aside a strongly held conviction in order to keep the peace or please the person in front of me. And, in our world today, certainly women do that quite frequently. They've tended and befriended in order to mitigate their fears. And I think one of the things I love so much about Jesus at stories with women in the Gospels is he's always inviting women to this resurrection posture and to speak. And so he's almost breaking them out of this tendency to tend and befriend. He's inviting them to step into their fear and walk right through it with him.
That's amazing. Yeah, I know in my own experience with fear, it was finding my way through instead
Yes.
of the being frozen or trying to avoid or pretend it wasn't there. That was the path of recovery and renewal and restoration.
And it's so interesting. Like those tactics work in the first half of our life. They even work in the second half of our life, but in the third half, math is hard. In the third half, we just can't hold it up anymore. And our fears will either eat us alive, or through God's grace and walking with Jesus, we can walk through them and become God's adult children, I should say.
Well, one of my counselors liked to say that fear was actually a doorway into the next good thing God had for me. And that helped my imagination for why I might lean into and make my way through something that felt terrifying to me.
Absolutely. If when we do walk through our fears, our imagination can be sparked. Fear can be like the doorway to imaginative possibility.
Well, so as I was reading through, another thing that really impressed me and rang true to my experience, you talked about how we might learn to behold our bodies. I know my own experience with childhood wounds led me to become a very cognitively focused person, up in my head, so to speak. And so the idea of embodied experience, I became more and more detached from those dynamics. So you suggest that we could learn to inhabit our bodies rather than using them. I love that phrase. Can you say more about that?
Well, I mean, that's sort of the language, certainly, of our time. And can I even very gently say, in Christianity, we use the using language. I'm going to use my body in this way. And that is different than inhabiting my body. Inhabiting means that I am more aware. And actually, inhabiting is more closely present. There is more of a union with this flesh and blood if I am inhabiting it. And as you say, it's tricky, and we need to keep Jesus close, because if we're going to inhabit our bodies, as Bessel van der Kolk says, they tell our stories. Yeah. They keep the score. So in the book, I talk about that I have the BRCA2 genetic abnormality. So I've had to have a prophylactic double mastectomy. And wow, did that bring home, okay, Lacy, you have a little work to do with your body. And it was fearful and freeing. Absolutely freeing. Wow.
Well, I think I remember Dallas often talking about every spiritual discipline involves our bodies inevitably. We are embodied. And I think sometimes we imagine that growing in our life with God will mostly be an idea thing or an insight thing or, something that happens inside of my brain cells. And it happens in the whole of who God's made me.
Absolutely. And these bodies are gift. So if we lock off the hard pieces, if we keep it right in our brain, then we also miss God's lavish love for us in a generous slab of chocolate cake. We miss God's lavish love for us when we hug someone we love dearly and we smell their perfume or cologne. We miss all of those parts of us that children, though children embody everything. This is why they put everything in their mouth. This is why when playing music in church, the youngest children will dance and move and wiggle and crawl under, over, and around the pews. And maybe we need to let them. Maybe they have something to teach us about what it looks like to worship in an embodied way.
Well, so one of the things that I have seen children teaching me. I just this morning got a video from my brother of his 2 young children, and they were giggling and screaming and yelling. It was about a minute's worth of that, and it was totally natural. It wasn't coached. Clearly, they weren't doing a program for anybody. They were just being themselves. And, in the book, you quote the line, "Joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God." I wonder how many of us know this truth in our lived experience. And maybe what does that look like in your own journey?
What does joy... And that's that is one of my favorite quotes from Pierre Desjardins. I love that one. I think in my own experience right now, it looks like letting my 2 adult kids teach me what it looks like to be joyful. So they are, empty nest is real. I'm just going to say that for anybody who's experiencing that. It's real deal. And so I have just a little touch of sorrow. They're doing their things, and I'm letting them teach me how to be joyful in their new explorations in life. So they're like, "Oh, Mom, la, 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 tell me a story about college or about something that they went and did or about some cooking absolute disaster." Thank God for fire alarms. So these things that they are joyful about exploring, I'm letting them receiving their joy and sharing it with them. And one of them is home for the summer, and that looks like, trying some new recipes on and thinking about apartment things. And just there are invitations for joy that are right in front of us. And mine are, and they're shaped by our social context. So mine looks like this. When they were little, it looked different. So what's like right now in your context where you could experience joy?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Well, and maybe related to joy is another thing kids are good at, which is play. But it often feels more and more unnatural for us as adults to play. You even talk about learning to play with God. What might that look like?
Well, it might look like, what is something you loved to do when you were a child? And, crack that open again. So what did you like to do when you were a child? And this time, do it with God. So have conversation with God while you're doing the thing. In the book, I tell a story about my friend Dave who fishes. That's what he does for play. And his conversation with God as he was fishing, that was so playful for him. For me, lately, it's painting. I loved to paint, but I didn't have a lot of painting materials. So I just would make paint out of the cleachy West Texas dirt and water, and then try to paint things on paper sacks. So lately I've been doing some Bob Ross videos, which and my paintings look nothing like his, but I have a wonderful time and I make a huge mess. So I'm painting lately and just having conversation with God. Really, what if we talked? What if our prayer or our talking with God was like a conversation that we have with another human being, and we expected to hear God answer? Well,
it would make sense, wouldn't it, that a conversation with God might, in part, revolve around creativity, being the creator that God is. That He would have a great interest in having conversations about creative expression.
I have a dear friend who disc golfs with God, on a biweekly basis. That's part of his rule of life. He and God play a game of disc golf.
That's great.
That's a great thing to put in your rule of life, I think.
Our youngest son enjoys that a lot. I haven't tried doing that with him yet, but I'll have to watch for an opportunity now.
That sounds terrific.
So, at one point, you share a story. I'm always looking for intersections with our theme, Unhurried Living. And you share a story about a family ski trip where you say the adults were on their way somewhere. Their agenda, they were trying to hurry the pack along to get to where they were going. But the kids, they were meandering and loosely following their parents, stopping and playing in each patch of snow they found. How might we learn the goodness of an unhurried life from the children in our lives?
Well, I think one of the things, there are several things that we can do. One is to follow them.
Yeah.
To actually follow them. So if we can, and I realize that when it comes to school and socks and shoes and getting papers and homework out the door, that is a special situation. But when we can, what if we canned our agenda? What if we let them set the pace? What if when we took a walk, it wasn't the end goal? What if when we went skiing, it wasn't actually the slopes? It was actually being fully present to the child in front of us. And can I just say that when we follow children, it will be a test and perhaps a training of our humility. Are we willing? Are we willing? It will certainly invite us to notice those places where we have maybe a disordered attachment to control, maybe a disordered attachment to outcomes. It will, trust me, it sounds like play, but it will be sharpening.
It will challenge us, won't it?
It will.
Our assumptions, our expectations.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things years ago, I did I was doing a conference. There was a group of people, and I made the announcement that we were going to pray with our bodies, which is a really simple, childlike prayer that children had taught me. There were no heavy, scary yoga moves, anything like that, just very simple. But I could see the wide-eyed look of a few people in the room, and they were like, get me out of here.
Oh, boy.
Get me out of here. And later, when I caught up with those people, just to make sure we were all okay, they said, no, I was so afraid I was going to look stupid.
Oh.
So one of the things that when we let children lead us into this playful freedom is it will ring those places where we're managing our image, what others think of us, what we think of ourselves. We just don't want to look silly sometimes, but maybe God is inviting us to a bit of silliness.
Well, it seems to me that may be part of what Jesus means when he says, you won't even enter the kingdom unless you come as little children. That gift of unself-consciousness.
Yes.
I'm thinking, as you were talking about following the kids in our lives, when our guys, 3 boys, were boys, not men. I remember one time I saw the 3 of them sitting in the backyard, all huddled around something on the ground. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I went over and I just sat with them, and I realized they were watching a bunch of ants do what ants do. Just apparently the most interesting thing in the backyard was the activity of the ants. And I sat there for a while with them, and I realized, yes, as you said earlier, there's something to be learned from just paying attention to what our kids pay attention to.
I remember having a holy listening, which is what we call the spiritual accompaniment, a holy listening session at Haven House outside. So it was summer, and there was no air conditioning. It was hot. And I'm sitting with the child on a blanket underneath a tree, and a little praying mantis is on the tree. And I have activities for us to do. And this kid wanted none of the activities, these, quote unquote, spiritual activities I had for us. He was not having it. In fact, God was encountering him in this praying mantis that he was watching. He was wondering, so do you think they're called praying mantis because they pray? If they pray, do trees pray? Do you think that all things pray? What do you think they're saying? Do you think they sing? There's 1,000 little questions. And God is infusing this little one's curiosity with spiritual insight. I should have taken my shoes off and thrown them across and it is holy ground. Yeah,
it sure is. Oh my goodness. The simplicity of that, the beauty of that. I loved praying mantises as a kid. I would go hunting them. We had them in our yard. There was a particular tree they really loved. So I would just be searching through this tall cypress tree for these little praying mantises. And if I found one, he was my companion for the day. Oh yeah, that's the best.
Isn't it great? But I a little one collected roly-polies, those little beetles that roll up, and this particular little one was neurodivergent on the autism spectrum, and so they needed to tell me all the details, these deep details about roly-polies, and about how they're actually more connected to lobsters than they are to bugs, and the wonder and amazement. And do you see, Lacy, how God protects them with their shell as they roll up when they get afraid? That's how God protects us. Did you know that, Lacy? No, I did not know that. That's how God protected them, like God protects us. So great.
That really is. Well, so at another point, you reflected on the gospel passage where Jesus thanks his Father for hiding certain things from the wise and revealing them to little children. I'm not sure if we've thought about the implications of that little line between Jesus and the Father. I guess the question, I think you raised it this way: what is it that children know that adults don't?
Yes, that to me, that is mind blowing. I mean, first of all, Jesus brings a child in the disciples' midst and says, "Be like this child. This is how you will enter the kingdom of God." Think of the gravity of those words. And then God says, "If you want, that I have given a special knowledge to children that adults don't have. I have revealed something to them." That's incredible.
It is. And I'm going to guess not too many other rabbis did something like that in the day of Jesus. I'm going to guess that was a one rabbi experience.
Yes. And I mean, there's just so much wonderful about it, how Jesus is shifting the power to the least of these. Yeah. I mean, within the Jewish community, children were honored, but certainly not with a special knowledge. Within the Roman community, they were not at all honored. So Jesus is taking a radical stance when you think about either community and shifting the power to the child, giving them value, place. I mean, think about that in terms of our churches. What if we said in our churches, who has a special knowledge among us? It's going to be the children. What do we have to learn from them?
Well, that's amazing. Well, so I was thinking toward the end of the book here, you talk about our work. Mm-hmm. And one of the lines you wrote was this: work is not the opposite of creativity and play. Work is a place to funnel our creativity through play. I think maybe work is one of the places where we lose most touch with our childlikeness. We don't see a connection maybe between that and productive, activity at work. Can you say more about how work might be a place to funnel our creativity?
Yes. And in fact, I think there's another quote that's similar to that, which is the opposite of play is depression.
Yes.
Not work.
Not work.
Not work. And, work is a place, if we're going to funnel creativity and play through our work, help them to be interwoven. One is we do need to do our work around releasing our outcomes. And it's not that we don't have goals and we don't have benchmarks, certainly, but we let those become a little bit more permeable. When Jesus fed 5,000 men, women, children, and nursery workers on a hillside, did he have that outcome in mind, or was he playing? It was work. It was work. They were passing around food in baskets, and that was work. But there was some kind of creative permeability there. I think the other is we take ourselves more lightly. So we lean into what is most important, which is the people in the moment, and we release how those outcomes can come into being.
Yeah, I think in our work, the productivity God may have in mind may be different than the productivity I have in mind, and maybe his idea is better.
Yes. And I think too, we need to do our own work. I say I need to continue to do my own inner work around what I think of failure. We often think of failure as being the one thing we must stay as far away from in our work. But failure is a part of learning. Is there such a thing as failure? That's a great question to ask us. In the kingdom of God, where all can be redeemed, is there such a thing as failure?
I think that's a really good question for our listeners to reflect on. Well, as we close our conversation, I would love to maybe ask if you would close it with a word of encouragement to our listeners, kind of in the spirit of our conversation and the spirit of the book you've written.
Let me think about that for just a second. Okay. My hope and prayer for you is this, that you will discover that at the core of who you are God's precious child, that you were created in God's loving embrace, and God continues to hold you in God's loving embrace. And from that place of security and safety, play and joy and creativity and imagination and freedom can flow for every one of us.
Well, those are beautiful, inviting words, and I hope those of us listening will take them to heart. Again, today, my guest has been Lacy Finn Borgo, and we've been talking about her book, Faith Like a Child. It's been a great pleasure to have this conversation, Lacy.
Thank you so much. It's good to chat with you.
And with you. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the next few episodes, I'll be talking with authors Todd Hunter and Eric Peterson. I'll also be sharing leadership insights in episodes titled Cultivating a Good Rest Ethic and Why Don't We Rest Well? I can't wait to share those with you. Now, if you'd like more help cultivating the unhurried way of life and work we talk about here on the podcast, I'd like to invite you to consider our training process called PACE. It's a certificate in leadership and soul care. It's the most robust training we offer. We'll help you grow in your spiritual leadership perspectives and skills, whatever your role of leadership might be. This is a 21-month process involving in-person retreats and Zoom gatherings with mentored learning and practice between. There really has never been a better time to give focused attention to your own spiritual life so you can help others do the same. Learn to live and lead from the inside out. Engage the gracious pace of Jesus and learn how to guide others into this life-giving way. If you'd like to learn more, please just visit our website at unhurriedliving.com/pace. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.